The main cause of humanity's downfall has remained the same as it was illustrated in the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The basic takeaway is we have a tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the devil is on that tree. So just meditate on that for a moment. The knowledge of good and evil, and the devil is there. What might happen? Well, it's not a stretch of the imagination to consider the possibility that the devil might contaminate that knowledge of good and evil. To think that all knowledge of good and evil is bad and God doesn't want us to have that knowledge is ridiculous. Like, how could anyone possibly think that? To think that is just utmost absurdity, right? What is the Ten Commandments all about? It's about telling you what's good and what's bad. What was Jesus's ministry about? Telling us what's good and what's bad, calling out the hypocrites, pointing us to the greatest commandments, right? To say that the knowledge of good and evil altogether is something God doesn't want us to have is absurd. So if you've been subconsciously or even consciously holding on to that absurd notion, you need to let go of it completely. The problem is the story has never been told correctly, which is simply that the knowledge of good and evil on that tree was corrupted, right? We have the devil on that tree, the worm in the apple, so to speak, right? So it's a corrupted knowledge of good and evil. And yes, if you eat of that fruit, you will surely face destruction, which is true. And so when God said to not eat of that fruit, that was good instruction. But he wasn't saying all knowledge of good and evil is bad. He was saying that fruit on that tree where the devil is corrupted knowledge of good and evil. And if you eat of that, you will be misled and you will be cast out of paradise, which is exactly what happened. And it continues to happen. And this false or corrupted knowledge of good and evil being pushed by false gods remains the main theme of why humanity is not in a positive situation and why things have actually been getting worse is because people are following a false morality pushed by false gods. These false gods today take the form of basically the so-called elite, the leaders or owners of various institutions, namely institutions of state, institutions in entertainment and media, right? And we have these so-called experts in medical institutions, right? Basically, the people presented to you on your TV screen as the authorities. Why did Adam and Eve listen to the devil instead of God? Because they idolized the devil. It was a false god, right? That's why the first commandment is to have no idols, right? Number one on the list. You think it might be important if it's put number one, right? Maybe to help us not forget. And yet, it's like people nowadays don't even think idol worship is possible. Looking at these so-called experts and authorities as gods on the earth who can tell us what's right and wrong, even though it goes against our own common sense and own ethics. And in case that's not obvious to you, I'll just repeat again because it bears repeating. It's worth repeating. Would you be okay with your neighbor coming by your door and saying, hey, here in my briefcase, I have various vials of chemical concoctions that I think are, the best. Me and my scientist buddy over here, um, we spent a lot of time in the lab, best wonder drug going. And so what we're going to need to do is inject you and your children with this, and continue to inject them with whatever new concoctions we come up with, for the end, for the rest of your lives, until the end of time. Just, be a good citizen, be a good neighbor, and go along with this. Oh, and we may also want to put coverings over the face of your children and your wife, and you know test you, and put swabs up your nose and whatnot. We basically are going to start micromanaging your life on a very invasive medical level. And if you don't comply, we're going to start making your life very difficult. We're going to start being even more aggressive towards you. We're going to restrict your travel. We might get you fired from your job. We're going to make it so your kids can't go to school, um, etc. Right? If your neighbor was doing all that to you, wouldn't you think that was completely crazy? Wouldn't you think that person had lost their mind, and that they're like a psycho, like that they're criminal? Yes, right? Most people would not accept such behavior from their neighbors. And why not? Because it's abusive. It's just obviously not right. And so why in the hell would you think that it's okay for some politician to do those very same things? It's ridiculous. The only reason you would think there's a difference between the human in the house across the street and the human in some White House, you know, in DC, is because you're an idol worshiper, because you believe in false gods and their false morality. Another example of this false morality is all of the campaigns coming from the top, right? These are all supported by the major institutions, either openly or covertly, is all of the campaigns against hate speech, right? We have hate speech um, laws now being pushed. We have hate-free zones, right? So what you need to get clear is hate is not necessarily a bad thing. Hate is the extreme dislike of something, right? You like something or you don't like something, and if you really don't like something, you could say, well, I hate it. It's extreme dislike. And guess what? That isn't immoral in and of itself. We don't want to be thought of as intolerant. We don't hate anybody. Really? You don't hate anybody? You don't hate the devil? Let me refer you to Hebrews 1:9. Quote, you have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has set you above your companions. Next, Amos 5:15. Quote, hate evil and love good. And also, just use your common sense, right? Hate means extreme dislike. How is that in and of itself a bad thing? It's not. It's a false morality to label hatred as an evil, right? And it's actually destructive to do so because it turns you away from what actually is evil, which is abuse, right? So we have the same establishment telling us that abuse, namely, this abuse of control through medical tyranny, is perfectly fine. But if you express hatred of anything or any behavior, then you're a bad person, right? It's false morality coming from false gods. And so this is what is misleading and sabotaging society. False moralities, if I can use that word in the plural, I don't know. Such as, hate is evil and extreme views is evil, when in fact neither are evil in and of themselves. Hate is just extreme dislike. Extreme is just another way of saying, unpopular, or, completely to one end of the spectrum, which isn't necessarily bad. Like, to be extremely against slavery is a good thing. You shouldn't be like tolerant of slavery or like 50% okay with it. You should be to the extreme. You should have the extremist view that all slavery is evil, right? So you need to think more clearly about what these words mean and whether they're actually bad or not. Because if you believe that the evil is good and the good is evil, that's what leads to destruction. For thousands of years, that's been the theme. Again, false gods pushing false morality. And when humans follow it, it takes them out of paradise, out of a healthy and harmonious society. And if we're going to get back to Eden, if we're going to get back to God's original design, we need to get this morality straight, which should not be a surprise to you if you're Christian, was pointed to very directly by Jesus when he pointed us to the greatest commandments, to love God, love others, and love ourself. Obedience to authority is not equivalent to love, right? He didn't say the greatest commandments is to obey the commandments of whatever human leaders are in your territory. No. It's not complicated, actually. You just have to follow the true morality taught by the true authority, and then you won't be misled into following false morality by false authority, right? The same false authority, as far as the institution of it that has continued to this day, that condemned, tortured, and murdered Jesus, right? As if that wasn't enough to prove that they're a false authority, right? What could be more proof that they would call the most good being on the planet evil? And yet again, they didn't get the picture, in this case largely because they believed the false doctrine by another false god, a false apostle in particular, Paul, who taught them that the crucifixion had nothing to do with exposing false authority and false morality, but was simply a blood sacrifice that pays for your sins, which Jesus never said it was going to be. He was actually against this idea that you could simply kill an innocent being and that be your free ticket to heaven, right? That's actually more of a satanic idea than it is anything that Jesus taught, right? This idea that you can torture and murder an innocent being and then that's your ticket to heaven. Think about that. Does that really make sense? But yet that's mainstream Christianity, right? That you're going to hear every single day on Christian radio and other programming telling you that you're this worthless sinner, right? You have inherited sin. God created you in an evil way, which is actually blasphemous. And the only solution is for you to believe in a blood sacrifice ritual. The solution isn't to do what Jesus commanded us to do, right? It's not to be perfect, to have exceedingly high righteousness. It's not to stop sinning, as he repeatedly said. It's not to actually follow Jesus. It's to follow the false apostle Paul, who tells you it's just a matter of faith in a blood sacrifice ritual. So the false morality and deception is indeed widespread and deeply ingrained, and that's why the world is the way it is. And hopefully more people will wake up to that and return to the greatest commandments, return to following the true authority and not these false authorities, these false gods, and get their ethics straight so we can get society straight as God intended and as he designed for us originally. All right. Thank you for listening.